The dormitive principle paradox arises from discussions in philosophy and theology concerning the nature of explanation and causation, and is most famously associated with the 17th century philosopher Nicolas Malebranche. At its core, the paradox reveals the problem of circular reasoning when an explanation merely restates what it purports to elucidate rather than offering any deeper insight into its cause. For example, when one argues that a substance induces sleep because it possesses a dormitive virtue, using a quality that by definition causes sleep, the explanation is effectively saying that sleep occurs because sleep occurs, which offers no additional understanding of the underlying mechanism. The term dormitive itself derives from the Latin word dormire, meaning to sleep, and this etymology underscores how the concept involves a kind of self-referential logic that seems to provide an explanation while simultaneously evading a genuine account of how sleep is produced. This paradox is significant because it challenges the adequacy of explanations that do not uncover the true causal factors behind a phenomenon, but instead rely on labels that are inherently uninformative. In scientific and philosophical inquiry, a robust explanation is expected to identify underlying processes that can be observed, tested, and understood through systematic investigation. When an explanation simply invokes a dormitive principle, it shuts down further inquiry by asserting that the cause is self-evident in the effect, thus precluding any deeper analysis of the mechanisms at work. This problem is not confined to historical debates, but remains relevant in modern discussions of causality, where there is a continuous effort to differentiate between mere description and genuine explanation. The paradox also highlights a broader issue within epistemology, the study of knowledge, by illustrating how language and conceptual frameworks can sometimes obscure more than they reveal. When explanations are couched in terms that simply restate the phenomenon, they risk becoming tautological, offering an illusion of understanding while leaving the fundamental question of why unanswered. This has implications not only in the realm of philosophy, but also in everyday reasoning, where individuals might be tempted to accept circular explanations for complex phenomena without seeking further clarification or evidence. In effect, the paradox challenges us to scrutinize the quality of our explanations and to ensure that our accounts of the world are not merely self-referential, but instead provide a bridge between observation and understanding. Its influence can be seen in various debates across disciplines, from the philosophy of mind, where questions about consciousness and intentionality often risk falling into circular explanations, to discussions in the natural sciences about the nature of causality and the limits of reductionism. The paradox invites us to consider how far we can push our explanatory frameworks before they become self-defeating, and it underscores the importance of identifying and articulating the underlying processes that truly account for the phenomena we observe. Ultimately, the dormitive principle paradox is not merely an abstract philosophical puzzle, but a reminder of the intellectual challenge inherent in any attempt to understand the world. It calls for a commitment to digging deeper than surface-level descriptions, and for an openness to questioning assumptions that may appear self-evident. In a broader sense, the paradox embodies the spirit of inquiry that drives both philosophy and science, the relentless pursuit of knowledge that goes beyond the obvious and seeks to uncover the intricate and often hidden connections that form the fabric of reality. This challenge remains as relevant today as it was in the time of Malebranche, urging contemporary thinkers to remain vigilant against the seductive simplicity of circular explanations and to continue striving for models of understanding that are both explanatory and empirically grounded. The Crocodile Paradox is a fascinating logical puzzle that arises from a scenario in which a crocodile steals a child, and the subsequent exchange between the crocodile and the parent sets up a condition that leads to a contradiction. In the classic formulation, the crocodile tells the parent, "I will return your child if and only if you correctly predict what I will do." Faced with this stipulation, the parent replies, "You will not return my child." This answer creates an irresolvable dilemma. If the crocodile returns the child, then the parent's prediction turns out to be false, contradicting his own condition for returning the child. Yet if he does not return the child, the prediction is proven true, which according to his promise should mean that he must return the child. This paradox illustrates the deep problems that can arise when conditional promises or threats are self-referential. The crocodile's rule ties its fulfillment directly to the truth value of a prediction made by the parent, which in turn is influenced by what the crocodile does. Because the statement, "You will not return my child," refers to the crocodile's potential action, any decision he makes ends up contradicting the condition he set out. In effect, the crocodile's rule becomes a feedback loop, where the outcome continuously affects the truth of the condition and vice versa, leading to a logical impasse. At its heart, the Crocodile Paradox is a striking example of how self-reference can undermine the consistency of a system of rules or promises, much like the Liar Paradox, where a statement such as, "This sentence is false," creates a contradiction. The crocodile's condition traps both parties in a loop where neither outcome can be logically sustained. The parent's prediction is designed to force a contradiction. If the crocodile were to act in a way that makes the prediction true, he would have to act against his own rule. If he acts in a way that makes the prediction false, the rule again dictates a different outcome. This inherent contradiction reveals a flaw in conditional reasoning when the conditions themselves depend on the outcome. Philosophically, the paradox challenges us to rethink the nature of conditional statements and the commitments that arise from them. It poses a fundamental question: can any promise or threat be perfectly constructed if it depends on a prediction about its own fulfillment? The crocodile's rule seems straightforward at first, but when examined closely, it becomes apparent that the promise is self-defeating. The scenario forces us to recognize that not all conditions can be cleanly separated from the outcomes they intend to regulate. When language and logic intertwine in this way, even the simplest seeming promises can give rise to complex and paradoxical situations. Moreover, the Crocodile Paradox has implications beyond a mere brain teaser. It has been discussed in contexts ranging from moral philosophy to legal theory, where conditional commitments are a common element. In contracts or negotiations, for instance, stipulations that rely on self-referential predictions can lead to outcomes that are difficult, if not impossible, to enforce. The paradox serves as a cautionary tale, warning that conditions based on anticipated actions may sometimes collapse under the weight of their own circularity. By challenging the conventional assumptions about causality and prediction, the paradox encourages deeper scrutiny of how conditions are framed and executed in real-life scenarios. Some scholars have attempted to resolve the paradox by scrutinizing the underlying logic. One line of thought is to argue that the crocodile's promise is not well formed. It contains an inherent ambiguity that defies a binary classification of true or false. If the condition is regarded as nonsensical or ill-posed, then the paradox might be sidestepped altogether by declaring that the crocodile's statement simply cannot generate a coherent truth value. Others have proposed analyzing the situation through modal or non-classical logics, which allow for a more nuanced treatment of conditionals that might accommodate the self-referential loop. However, these approaches often come with their own complexities and do not fully dispel the tension at the heart of the paradox. The broader significance of the Crocodile Paradox lies in its ability to expose the limits of our intuitive reasoning about cause and effect. It compels us to examine whether our language, especially when it involves promises, threats, or predictions, is always capable of accurately capturing reality without falling into self-contradiction. By highlighting how a seemingly simple rule can break down under self-reference, the paradox has influenced discussions in logic, philosophy of language, and even computer science, where self-referential algorithms can lead to similar types of recursive problems. In everyday life, the paradox also serves as a metaphor for situations where commitments or expectations become entangled with the outcomes they are meant to control. Consider any scenario where a person's promise is conditional on another's belief or prediction about that very promise. The crocodile's dilemma reminds us that such self-referential commitments may be inherently unstable or contradictory. This realization encourages a more careful formulation of promises and contracts, one that avoids tying the fulfillment of a commitment to a prediction that might, by its very nature, create a logical impasse. Ultimately, the Crocodile Paradox is more than just an abstract logical puzzle. It is a vivid illustration of the challenges posed by self-reference in any system of rules or language. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that not all conditions or promises can be harmonized with the outcomes they are meant to govern. As a result, the paradox continues to be a valuable tool for philosophers and logicians, as well as a compelling narrative device that captures the complexity of human communication and reasoning. The court paradox, often associated with the ancient dispute between the sophist Protagoras and his student Euathlus, presents a fascinating challenge to our understanding of legal commitments and logical consistency. In this scenario, Protagoras agrees to teach Euathlus and stipulates that his fee will be paid once Euathlus wins his first court case. Euathlus, however, finds himself in a dilemma when he neither initiates a lawsuit nor wins any case for some time, ultimately leading Protagoras to take legal action to recover the fee. The paradox emerges from the conflicting interpretations of the agreement and the court's role in enforcing it. At the heart of the paradox is the structure of the conditional promise itself. According to the terms agreed upon, if Euathlus wins his first case, then he must pay Protagoras the fee. Conversely, if he loses, the outcome seems to suggest that he still hasn't fulfilled the condition to trigger the fee, leaving both parties in a state of logical uncertainty. When the court is called upon to decide the matter, it finds itself caught between two contradictory outcomes. If the court rules in favor of Euathlus, it would imply that he has indeed won his first case, thereby activating the obligation to pay, which contradicts the decision in his favor. On the other hand, if the court rules against him, then by its own judgment, he loses the case, But losing the case would also mean that the condition for payment, winning a case, has not been met, ostensibly absolving him of the fee. This logical impasse is a striking example of self-referential paradoxes, where the conditions of an agreement refer back to the outcome of a decision that is itself meant to resolve the agreement. The paradox challenges the idea that every contract or promise can be neatly enforced through binary legal judgments. In the case of the court paradox, the very mechanism intended to determine the outcome, the court's decision, creates a situation in which no consistent resolution is possible without contradiction. The outcome is entangled in a loop. Any ruling by the court seems to retroactively undermine its own logical foundation. Scholars and logicians have long debated whether a resolution to the court paradox is possible within classical logic. Some have argued that the contract between Protagoras and Euathlus is inherently flawed or ambiguous, meaning that the promise itself is a poorly formulated conditional that defies clear-cut interpretation. Others suggest that alternative forms of logic, such as non-classical or paraconsistent logic, might offer a framework within which such self-referential conditions can be analyzed without collapsing into contradiction. These discussions often highlight the limitations of traditional binary logic when applied to complex human agreements that involve future contingencies and self-reference. Beyond its theoretical implications, the court paradox also raises important questions about the nature of legal reasoning and contractual commitments. It serves as a reminder that legal agreements must be carefully drafted to avoid ambiguities that could lead to irresolvable conflicts. In practical terms, the paradox warns of the potential pitfalls in contracts where payment or penalty clauses are contingent on future events that are themselves subject to interpretation by a third party. Such scenarios underscore the need for clarity and precision in legal language, as well as the potential dangers of embedding self-referential conditions within enforceable agreements. Historically, the dispute between Protagoras and Euathlus has been cited as a case study in the philosophy of law, prompting thinkers to explore the interplay between ethics, logic, and legal obligation. The paradox not only demonstrates how self-reference can undermine the apparent simplicity of contractual terms, but also invites a broader reflection on the reliability of legal institutions to resolve disputes that are entangled in their own definitions. In many ways, the court paradox can be seen as a microcosm of larger debates about the limits of language and logic in capturing the complexities of human relationships and social contracts. The implications of the court paradox extend even into modern legal theory and contract law. Today, courts and legal scholars are increasingly aware of the need to construct agreements that can withstand not only practical challenges, but also theoretical scrutiny. The paradox highlights the importance of drafting clauses that avoid circular dependencies, terms that, when enforced, do not feed back into themselves in a way that renders them indeterminate. By studying such paradoxes, legal theorists gain valuable insights into how to design legal frameworks that are both fair and logically consistent, ensuring that justice is administered without falling into paradoxical traps. In reflecting on the court paradox, one is led to appreciate the delicate balance between legal formality and logical coherence. The paradox underscores that a promise or contract is only as strong as the clarity of its terms and the ability of its enforcers to interpret it without contradiction. While the story of Protagoras and Euathlus may seem like an ancient anecdote, its lessons are timeless. Language and logic, when intertwined in human agreements, can produce unforeseen complications that challenge even the most sophisticated judicial systems. Ultimately, the court paradox is not merely an intellectual curiosity, but a powerful illustration of the challenges inherent in combining conditional promises with legal enforcement. It reminds us that while our legal institutions strive for fairness and clarity, they must also grapple with the inherent complexities of language and human expectation. The paradox endures as a subject of debate and reflection, urging both legal practitioners and philosophers to continuously refine the principles that underpin contractual and judicial reasoning. The Preface Paradox is an intriguing epistemological puzzle that arises when an author, confident in the truth of every individual statement in their work, simultaneously acknowledges in the preface that it is likely at least one error exists somewhere within it. This paradox challenges our intuitive understanding of justification by revealing that, while each claim might be supported by strong evidence or rigorous reasoning, the aggregate probability that every claim is correct diminishes as the number of claims increases. At its core, the paradox illustrates the tension between what we might call local and global beliefs. Locally, each individual proposition is well justified and can be believed with a high degree of certainty. However, when these propositions are considered collectively, the likelihood that every single one is true becomes significantly lower due to human fallibility and the inherent possibility of mistakes. In essence, an author can rationally believe each specific detail while also rationally suspecting that when taken as a whole, the work may contain errors. This situation forces us to rethink how justification works. Traditional models of rational belief might suggest that if every part of a whole is individually credible, then the whole should be credible as well. Yet the Preface Paradox shows that our confidence in the individual parts does not necessarily translate into confidence in the overall error-free nature of the work. The paradox arises because the cumulative risk of error increases with the number of claims, meaning that even a collection of well-supported beliefs might, in total, be less reliable than each belief considered in isolation. Philosophers have approached this paradox from various angles. One common resolution is to distinguish between the standards for local justification and those for global justification. While each individual claim can be supported by solid evidence, believing that the entire set of claims is completely free from error demands a much stronger, often unattainable level of certainty. This insight allows us to understand that it is not irrational to maintain both a high confidence in each individual fact and a cautious skepticism about the complete absence of error in the work. Another perspective employs probabilistic reasoning. Even if the chance of any one statement being wrong is very small, when multiplied across a large number of statements, the probability that at least one mistake exists becomes appreciable. This statistical viewpoint helps to clarify why it is reasonable for an author to assert confidence in each piece of evidence, while also accepting that the overall work might not be entirely flawless. The Preface Paradox also has broader implications beyond the realm of academic writing. It serves as a reminder that in any complex system, be it scientific theories, legal arguments, or everyday decision-making, the aggregation of individually reliable pieces of information can introduce a level of uncertainty that challenges our overall certainty. Recognizing this helps foster a more nuanced approach to knowledge, one that accepts the inevitability of error in complex endeavors and values, continuous scrutiny, and revision. Moreover, this paradox has influenced debates in epistemology regarding the nature of justified belief and fallibilism. Fallibilism, the idea that any belief might be subject to revision in the light of new evidence, aligns closely with the insights provided by the Preface Paradox. It teaches us that acknowledging the possibility of error is not a weakness, but a realistic acceptance of human limitations. By admitting that errors can occur, even in a well-researched and carefully written work, authors, scientists, and thinkers can remain open to new insights and improvements. In practical terms, the lessons of the Preface Paradox encourage us to maintain a critical stance toward aggregated evidence. It is one thing to believe in the validity of individual pieces of information, and quite another to claim absolute certainty in their collective truth. This awareness can lead to better practices in research and communication, such as rigorous peer review and iterative revisions, all aimed at minimizing the impact of potential errors, while understanding that complete perfection is often an ideal rather than a reality. Ultimately, the Preface Paradox enriches our understanding of rational belief by demonstrating that certainty in individual details does not automatically extend to certainty in the whole. It challenges the notion that a system is entirely reliable simply because its parts are reliable, urging us to consider the cumulative effects of small uncertainties. This nuanced perspective is crucial not only for philosophers and scholars, but also for anyone engaged in the process of constructing or evaluating complex bodies of knowledge. The Grue Paradox is a fascinating challenge to the traditional notion of inductive reasoning and our understanding of how we generalize from past observations to future predictions. It originated with Nelson Goodman in his discussion of the new riddle of induction, where he introduced the predicate Grue to expose a deep problem in our methods of confirmation. An object is defined as Grue if it is observed before a certain arbitrary time t and is green, or if it is observed after time t and is blue. At first glance, if all emeralds we have seen before time t are green, they are also Grue by definition. This leads us to the perplexing question: why should we expect that all emeralds will remain green rather than turning blue after time t, even though our past observations support both predictions equally? This paradox forces us to confront the ambiguity inherent in the language we use to describe our observations. The standard predicate green seems straightforward, yet when we introduce a seemingly equivalent predicate like Grue, the reliability of our inductive inferences comes under scrutiny. Goodman's insight was to show that the predicates we choose are not neutral. They carry with them assumptions about the uniformity of nature. In our everyday experience, we lean towards the expectation that an emerald observed as green will continue to be green, because green is entrenched in our language and scientific practice. However, the Grue Paradox reveals that this expectation is based on convention rather than an absolute logical necessity. At the heart of the issue is the problem of induction. How do we justify our predictions about unobserved instances based on the evidence we have? Traditionally, if every emerald we have ever seen is green, it seems rational to infer that all emeralds are green. But when we introduce the predicate Grue, the same evidence supports the inference that all emeralds are Grue. If we were to accept that all emeralds are Grue, then after the arbitrary time t, they should appear blue, contradicting our everyday observation of their color. This duality illustrates that our reasoning is influenced not only by the evidence, but also by the conceptual framework and language we choose to apply. Goodman's paradox challenges the idea that there is an objective way to select the right predicates for describing the world. It exposes the fact that our language, which we use to form generalizations and make predictions, is laden with historical and cultural biases. The choice to favor the predicate green over Grue seems natural and unproblematic, but Goodman argues that this preference is arbitrary unless we can provide a principled justification for it. In effect, the Grue Paradox compels us to examine the criteria by which we deem one set of hypotheses more acceptable than another, even when both are equally supported by past observations. One way to approach the Grue Paradox is to consider the role of simplicity and projectability in our scientific theories. The predicate green is considered more projectable. It has proven useful in countless applications and predictions across various contexts. Scientists prefer predicates that not only describe observed phenomena, but also reliably predict future occurrences. In contrast, Grue may fit the past data, but its predictive power is less convincing because it requires an abrupt and unexplained change in properties at time t. In this way, the preference for green over Grue reflects a broader epistemological commitment to theories that are simpler, more unified, and more consistent with our overall experience of nature. Furthermore, the Grue Paradox illustrates the limitations of classical logic when applied to empirical reasoning. It raises the question of whether our conventional notions of confirmation and evidence are sufficient for justifying our inductive practices. If evidence can equally support two incompatible hypotheses, as in the case of all emeralds are green versus all emeralds are Grue, then we must ask what additional criteria are necessary to choose between them. Many philosophers have argued that factors such as explanatory power, coherence with other well-established theories, and pragmatic considerations play a crucial role in resolving such dilemmas. The implications of the Grue Paradox extend far beyond the philosophy of science. They touch on broader issues in epistemology, such as the nature of rational belief and the problem of underdetermination. The idea that available evidence may be insufficient to determine a unique theory. By challenging the simplicity of our inductive inferences, the Grue Paradox encourages us to be more critical about the assumptions underlying our reasoning processes. It reminds us that the certainty we feel in our everyday generalizations is, to some extent, a product of our linguistic and conceptual conventions, which might not be as universally justified as we assume. In practical terms, the Grue Paradox serves as a powerful reminder of the tentative nature of our knowledge. Even when empirical evidence strongly supports a particular conclusion, there is always room for re-evaluation in light of new perspectives or definitions. This humility in the face of uncertainty is a cornerstone of scientific inquiry. Rather than viewing our theories as absolute truths, we can see them as provisional models that best fit the data according to our current conceptual framework. The Grue Paradox, then, is not just a puzzle, but an invitation to continuously refine our understanding of the world. Ultimately, the Grue Paradox is a thought-provoking example of how language and logic intersect in the realm of empirical science. It exposes the subtle ways in which our expectations about the future are intertwined with the descriptive tools we use to interpret the past. by highlighting the dependence of inductive reasoning on the choice of predicates. The paradox encourages us to question the foundations of our scientific and philosophical methodologies. In doing so, it deepens our appreciation for the complexities of confirming and predicting the natural world, reminding us that even our most reliable inferences rest on assumptions that merit careful scrutiny. The Forgetful Driver Paradox is a fascinating puzzle in decision theory that explores the challenges of making optimal decisions under conditions of imperfect memory and uncertainty. Imagine a driver who must navigate a highway with multiple exits, but due to forgetfulness, cannot recall which exit he has already passed or where he currently is. This absence of reliable self-knowledge creates a scenario in which the driver must commit to a strategy without being able to condition his decisions on his exact location along the route. At the heart of the paradox lies the idea of imperfect recall, which forces the driver to rely on probabilistic decision-making rather than a simple, deterministic plan. In a typical formulation, the driver faces a series of intersections, each with its own payoff. For instance, the first exit might lead to an unpleasant outcome, a low payoff, while a later exit might offer a far better reward, such as getting home safely. However, because the driver is forgetful, when he reaches an intersection, he cannot tell whether he has already bypassed the beneficial exit or not. This uncertainty means that his decision on whether to exit or continue must be based on a pre-committed strategy, often formulated as a probability of choosing to exit at any given intersection. What makes the paradox so intriguing is the way it challenges traditional models of rational choice. Under conditions of perfect recall, a decision-maker would simply exit at the optimal point, ensuring the best possible outcome. But in this case, the driver's forgetfulness leads to a situation where his optimal strategy, calculated before setting out on his journey, may not be dynamically consistent. In other words, although the driver may have devised a plan that maximizes his expected payoff from an ex-ante perspective, when he is actually at an intersection, he cannot adjust his decision based on his prior actions or the current state of the journey. This dissonance between the initial plan and the decisions made in the moment is at the core of the paradox. The paradox also highlights an important aspect of decision theory, the difference between ex-ante and ex-post evaluations. Ex-ante, or before the journey begins, the driver can calculate the expected outcomes of various strategies by weighing the potential payoffs at different exits against the probabilities of reaching them. However, ex post, when the driver finds himself at an intersection, the lack of memory about his previous decisions means that he must rely solely on his pre-established strategy. This leads to an inherent tension where the plan that seems optimal from a detached, analytical viewpoint may not be the one the driver would choose if he were fully aware of his location and previous actions. Another layer of complexity comes from the idea of self-referential decision-making. The driver's strategy must account for the fact that his future decisions are based on the same set of rules he established at the outset, despite his inability to update them with new information. This can result in counterintuitive outcomes, where, paradoxically, a strategy that appears less adaptive in a fully informed scenario turns out to yield a higher expected payoff precisely because it accounts for the driver's forgetfulness. It forces us to rethink the notion of rationality in contexts where memory and information are limited. Philosophers and economists have used the Forgetful Driver Paradox to illustrate the limitations of standard decision theory models. The paradox challenges the assumption that rational decision-making always involves the optimal use of available information. Instead, it shows that when a decision-maker is systematically deprived of certain kinds of information, such as the precise point along a journey, the very nature of what constitutes an optimal decision can change. In this way, the paradox has influenced broader discussions about the role of memory, self-knowledge, and time consistency in rational choice theory. Moreover, the paradox has practical implications beyond theoretical puzzles. It sheds light on everyday situations where individuals must make decisions without complete information about their past actions or current state. For example, consider a person trying to follow a long, complex set of instructions while distracted or under stress. Just as with the forgetful driver, the person might have a well-formulated plan in theory, but find it difficult to execute optimally in practice due to lapses in attention or memory. This understanding can inform the design of systems and processes, whether in technology, management, or public policy, that aim to mitigate the effects of imperfect recall. In exploring the Forgetful Driver Paradox, we also encounter the broader issue of dynamic consistency. Dynamic consistency is the idea that a plan made at one point in time should remain the best course of action as circumstances evolve. However, in cases where memory is impaired, the driver's inability to update his strategy dynamically means that even a plan that is optimal at the outset might fail to be the best choice in the moment. This has spurred further research into decision-making models that explicitly incorporate elements like forgetfulness and imperfect recall, thereby providing a richer framework for understanding human behavior. Ultimately, the Forgetful Driver Paradox invites us to reflect on the nature of rational decision-making under uncertainty. It reveals that the challenges of imperfect memory and self-reference can lead to outcomes that defy our intuitions about what it means to act optimally. By examining this paradox, we gain valuable insights into the limitations of classical decision theory and the need for more nuanced models that can capture the complexities of real-world decision-making. The paradox not only enriches our theoretical understanding, but also offers practical lessons for designing systems and strategies in environments where information is inherently incomplete or unreliable. The lottery paradox is a compelling puzzle in epistemology that challenges our intuitions about rational belief and probability. It begins with the seemingly uncontroversial observation that in a fair lottery, each individual ticket has an extremely high probability of losing. On that basis, it appears rational for someone to believe of any particular ticket that it will lose. However, if one were to extend that reasoning to every single ticket, one would be led to the absurd conclusion that no ticket will win, despite the fact that, by the very design of a lottery, one ticket must indeed win. This tension between high probability and certainty in aggregate belief lies at the heart of the paradox. The puzzle forces us to confront a central issue in the theory of rational belief, the challenge of aggregating many individually rational beliefs into a coherent overall belief. When considering a single lottery ticket, the chance of winning is so minute that it seems reasonable to hold the belief that it will lose. Yet, when one considers hundreds or thousands of tickets, the probability that every single ticket loses becomes nearly zero. In other words, while it is individually rational to believe that any given ticket will lose, it is collectively irrational to believe that all tickets will lose, because that contradicts the inevitable outcome of the lottery. This apparent inconsistency highlights the difficulty in moving from local beliefs about individual events, to a global belief about a system as a whole. It raises the question of whether our standards for justification should be the same when applied to isolated cases as when applied to the conjunction of all those cases. If the justification for believing a single ticket will lose is based solely on its high probability, then accepting this belief for each ticket independently seems justified. But the aggregation of these beliefs leads to a contradiction, because we know with certainty that one ticket must win, which means that the combined set of beliefs cannot all be true simultaneously. The lottery paradox also brings into focus the problem of defeasibility in our reasoning. A belief is defeasible if new evidence can undermine it without rendering it irrational to have held that belief in the first place. In the context of the lottery, the evidence, i.e., the high probability of losing, supports the belief about any individual ticket. However, when considering the broader context that one ticket will win, the same evidence is no longer sufficient to justify the belief that every ticket will lose. This illustrates how our rational commitments must sometimes be adjusted when we consider the interplay between individual probabilities and collective outcomes. Philosophers have offered several approaches to resolving the paradox. One common strategy is to refine our concept of rational belief by distinguishing between what is justified and what is known with certainty. Under this view, it may be perfectly rational to believe that any single ticket will lose based on its high probability, even if it is not epistemically justified to believe with certainty that every ticket will lose. In other words, the justification for our beliefs about each ticket is context-dependent and does not necessarily extend to an all-encompassing global belief about the lottery outcome. Another approach is to introduce a probabilistic threshold for belief that acknowledges the cumulative impact of multiple events. Instead of adopting a binary view, either a ticket will lose or it will win, this perspective accepts degrees of belief. It recognizes that while the probability of a win for any one ticket is negligible, the cumulative probability across all tickets must be taken into account. This method allows for a more nuanced understanding of how individually reasonable beliefs can, when aggregated, lead to a lower overall degree of confidence in a particular outcome. The paradox also has practical implications for how we think about decision-making under uncertainty in everyday life. It serves as a reminder that the rationality of our beliefs can depend on the scale at which we apply our reasoning. For example, in situations where we must make decisions based on a large number of probabilistic events, whether in finance, medicine, or risk management, the challenge of aggregating individual probabilities into a coherent whole is a common and significant problem. The lottery paradox thus encourages us to be cautious when generalizing from small probabilities to collective outcomes. Ultimately, the lottery paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a powerful illustration of the complexities involved in our understanding of rational belief and probability. It challenges us to rethink how we justify our beliefs when faced with a multitude of low-probability events, and it underscores the need for a more refined framework that can accommodate both the strengths and limitations of inductive reasoning. By examining the paradox, we gain deeper insight into the nature of epistemic justification, the interplay between local and global beliefs, and the ways in which our reasoning processes must adapt to the realities of uncertainty. The Sleeping Beauty problem is a thought-provoking puzzle that sits at the intersection of probability theory, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. In this problem, Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday, and a fair coin is tossed. If the coin lands heads, she is awakened on Monday, and then allowed to sleep through Tuesday without further awakenings. However, if the coin lands tails, she is awakened on both Monday and Tuesday, with her memory of the Monday awakening erased before the Tuesday awakening. When she is awakened without any recollection of previous awakenings, she is asked, "What is your credence that the coin landed heads?" This seemingly simple question has sparked a debate between two camps, commonly referred to as the halfers and the thirders, each presenting compelling arguments based on different approaches to conditional probability and self-locating belief. The halfers argue that since the coin is fair, the probability of heads remains 1/2, regardless of the additional awakenings. Their reasoning is based on the idea that the coin toss is an independent event that has no causal connection with the number of times Sleeping Beauty is awakened. Thus, even if she is awakened more than once in the tails scenario, this multiplicity does not affect the initial probability of the coin landing heads. For the halfers, the key is to consider the fact that the coin toss itself is unaffected by subsequent memory erasures or awakenings. Therefore, her credence in heads should remain at 50%. In contrast, the thirders maintain that Sleeping Beauty should assign a credence of 1/3 to heads. Their argument is built on the observation that, upon awakening, she finds herself in one of 3 possible states, either Monday after heads, Monday after tails, or Tuesday after tails. Since these awakenings are indistinguishable to her due to her memory loss, and assuming that the coin is fair, each awakening is considered equally likely. Under this view, only one of these 3 awakening scenarios corresponds to the coin landing heads, leading to a probability of 1/3 for heads. This reasoning hinges on the principle that the additional awakenings in the tails condition effectively dilute the probability of any single awakening corresponding to heads. The debate between these two positions is not merely about mathematical probability, but also touches on deeper issues concerning self-locating belief, beliefs about one's place in a series of events, and how to update such beliefs in light of new, albeit ambiguous, evidence. The thirders emphasize that when Sleeping Beauty is awakened, she must account for the fact that the process itself has introduced a kind of bias. The tails outcome produces more awakenings, making it statistically more likely for her to find herself in a tails scenario upon any random awakening. In contrast, the halfers argue that the extra awakenings do not change the fundamental probability of the coin toss. Rather, they suggest that any change in belief should only be based on the outcome of the coin toss, and not on the number of times she is awakened. This paradox invites us to reconsider how we approach the aggregation of probabilities over multiple instances that are indistinguishable to the observer. It challenges traditional methods of updating beliefs in cases where self-locating uncertainty is significant. One of the core issues is whether one should count each awakening as an independent piece of evidence, or whether the evidence should be tied solely to the original random event, the coin toss, that set the conditions of the experiment. The resolution of this question has implications not only for thought experiments like Sleeping Beauty, but also for real-world situations where agents must make decisions with incomplete or self-limited information. Moreover, the Sleeping Beauty problem has spurred a variety of extensions and variations in the literature, each aimed at exploring the boundaries of inductive reasoning and the principles of probability updating. Some philosophers have proposed modifications that involve different memory conditions or alternative ways of structuring the awakenings, while others have connected the problem to similar puzzles in anthropic reasoning and indexical information. Through these discussions, the problem has grown into a rich field of inquiry, one that probes the very nature of belief, evidence, and rational decision-making when faced with uncertainty about one's temporal location. In examining the different responses to the Sleeping Beauty problem, one gains a deeper appreciation for the subtleties involved in probabilistic reasoning. The Halfer's perspective highlights a commitment to the idea that prior probabilities should remain unaltered by subsequent, independent events, suggesting that the objective chance of the coin toss is the only relevant factor. The thirders, on the other hand, underscore the importance of accounting for the observer's perspective and the frequency with which different outcomes present themselves to the individual. This division has led to a broader discussion about how to appropriately weight evidence that is generated by processes that inherently change the sample space of possible experiences. Ultimately, the Sleeping Beauty problem is much more than an abstract puzzle. It is a window into the complexities of rational thought under uncertainty. Whether one finds the Halfer or the third position more persuasive, the problem compels us to scrutinize the assumptions behind our probabilistic models and to consider the nuanced ways in which our self-awareness, or lack thereof, can influence our beliefs. It is a challenge to our intuitions about fairness and randomness, pushing us to develop more sophisticated tools for handling cases where our knowledge is intrinsically limited by the structure of our experiences. In doing so, it not only enriches the theoretical landscape of epistemology and probability theory, but also offers practical insights into how we might navigate uncertain scenarios in everyday life. The analysis paradox is a perplexing dilemma in analytic philosophy that challenges our understanding of what it means to truly analyze a concept. At its heart, the paradox arises from the tension between providing an analysis that is both correct, that is, it captures exactly the meaning of the concept, and informative, meaning it offers insight beyond what is already apparent in the concept itself. If an analysis is entirely correct, then it must be equivalent to the concept it seeks to elucidate, making it seem trivial or even redundant. Yet if the analysis adds new information, it risks deviating from the very meaning it intends to explicate. One way to understand this paradox is to consider the task of defining a term like knowledge. A philosopher might strive to break down knowledge into its components, justified true belief, plus certain additional conditions. But in doing so, they are faced with the challenge of ensuring that the resulting definition is not only accurate, but also sheds light on what distinguishes knowledge from mere opinion. If the analysis is too coarse or obvious, it fails to inform. If it is too elaborate, it may no longer be synonymous with the everyday concept of knowledge. This is the crux of the analysis paradox. The more precisely we pin down a concept, the more likely our analysis is to be either trivial or unavoidably controversial. Historically, the paradox has been discussed in the context of the broader project of philosophical analysis, a central enterprise of 20th century analytic philosophy. Thinkers like G.E. Moore and Ludwig Wittgenstein have grappled with similar concerns. Moore, for instance, was famous for insisting on common-sense beliefs, suggesting that any analysis that strays too far from our intuitive understanding is suspect. Wittgenstein, on the other hand, argued that many philosophical problems dissolve once we appreciate the ordinary use of language. In his view, the attempt to provide an analysis that is both novel and correct might be misguided because the meaning of a word is rooted in its usage, and any analysis that ignores that usage misses the point entirely. The paradox also touches on the notion of synonymy, the idea that two expressions can mean the same thing. A successful analysis should yield a definition that is, in some sense, synonymous with the original concept. However, if the analysis is truly synonymous, then it becomes difficult to see how it could possibly provide any additional insight. It is merely restating what we already knew. Conversely, if the analysis appears to offer new information, it might imply that the original concept was somehow incomplete or ambiguous. This duality creates a sort of logical impasse where the goals of precision and informativeness seem to be at odds with one another. To illustrate, imagine trying to analyze the concept of art. One might be tempted to define art as anything that is created with the intention of expressing emotions or ideas. While this definition captures an important aspect of art, it also seems too broad. Many things created with intent might not be considered art by everyone. Alternatively, if one refines the analysis to include criteria like aesthetic value or cultural significance, the definition might become so restrictive that it excludes forms of art that are widely accepted. The analysis paradox here is evident. The more detailed the analysis, the greater the risk of either reducing the concept to something trivial or excluding aspects that are essential to its ordinary meaning. Philosophers have proposed several approaches to mitigate the paradox. One strategy is to accept a degree of vagueness or indeterminacy in our analyses. Instead of seeking a rigid, all-encompassing definition, we might acknowledge that many concepts operate in a gray area, where a certain level of flexibility is both inevitable and desirable. This approach allows us to preserve the utility of an analysis without demanding an impossible level of precision. Another response is to differentiate between different types of analyses. Some analyses are meant to be explanatory. They help us understand why a concept works the way it does, even if they do not capture every nuance of its meaning. Others might aim for a more formal, logical definition that can be used as a basis for rigorous argumentation. Recognizing that these different kinds of analysis serve different purposes can help us see that the paradox is not so much a flaw in our reasoning as it is a reflection of the diverse roles that definitions and explanations play in our intellectual lives. The analysis paradox also has broader implications for the nature of philosophical inquiry. It reminds us that language is a living, evolving tool, and that our attempts to nail down its meanings are often constrained by the very practices and conventions that give language its power. In this light, the paradox is not merely a problem to be solved, but a feature of our cognitive landscape. It underscores the idea that the quest for absolute clarity may sometimes lead us into a maze of self-referential puzzles. Moreover, the paradox invites us to reflect on the limits of formal methods in philosophy. While formal logic and rigorous analysis have their place, they might not be sufficient to capture the full richness of human concepts and experiences. The analysis paradox thus serves as a cautionary tale about the potential pitfalls of over-formalization. It encourages us to balance precision with a recognition of the subtleties inherent in our everyday language and thought. In practice, the insights drawn from the analysis paradox have influenced fields beyond philosophy, including linguistics, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence. In these disciplines, researchers grapple with the challenge of creating models that are both accurate and meaningful. Whether it is designing a natural language processing system or developing theories of concept formation, the lessons of the analysis paradox remind us that the relationship between meaning and definition is complex and often counterintuitive. The Raven Paradox is a classic puzzle in the philosophy of science and confirmation theory that challenges our intuitions about how evidence supports general statements. It begins with the seemingly straightforward hypothesis, all ravens are black. At first glance, it appears that the best way to confirm this claim is to observe ravens and verify that they are indeed black. However, through a twist of logical equivalence, the hypothesis, all ravens are black, can be reformulated as, everything that is not black is not a raven. This equivalence implies that if you observe any non-black object and confirm that it is not a raven, for example, a white shoe or a red apple, then that observation should, in theory, serve as evidence for the original hypothesis. This result is counterintuitive because it suggests that even a green bottle, which seems completely unrelated to ravens, provides some degree of confirmation for the claim that all ravens are black. To understand why this is perplexing, consider how confirmation is supposed to work. In everyday reasoning, we expect that the most relevant evidence for a hypothesis will come from instances directly related to that hypothesis. In our case, the direct evidence would be the observation of ravens. Yet, according to the paradox, every non-black object we encounter that is not a raven also counts as supporting evidence. The more non-black objects we observe that are not ravens, the more we seemingly confirm the hypothesis. This line of reasoning leads to an aggregation of evidence that feels almost absurd because it implies that mundane observations about common objects can bolster a hypothesis about ravens. The heart of the paradox lies in the concept of confirmation and how we measure the strength of evidence. Philosophers have argued about whether the confirmation of a universal statement should be sensitive to the relevance of the evidence. In the case of the Raven Paradox, the principle of confirmation by instances appears to treat every piece of evidence equally if it conforms to the logical structure of the hypothesis. However, intuitively, a single observation of a black raven should carry much more weight than a single observation of a green apple. The paradox forces us to confront the idea that our logical frameworks for confirmation might not align neatly with our intuitive judgments about relevance and importance. One way to address this issue is by introducing a notion of degree of confirmation, rather than a simple yes or no metric. Some theorists suggest that although a non-black non-raven does confirm all ravens are black, its confirmatory power is extremely weak compared to that of an observation of a black raven. Under this approach, the confirmation is not uniform, but weighted by how directly an observation is connected to the hypothesis. In practical terms, while every non-black object that is not a raven technically supports the hypothesis, the cumulative effect of these observations might still be negligible compared to the robust support provided by a series of direct observations of black ravens. Another approach is to refine the criteria for what constitutes relevant evidence in a scientific context. The intuition is that the method of confirmation should prioritize evidence that directly tests the hypothesis. In this view, although the logical equivalence holds, scientists might choose to discount evidence from irrelevant domains, such as the color of apples or cars, when assessing a hypothesis about ravens. This selective approach allows us to maintain that only evidence that bears a close connection to the subject of the hypothesis should count significantly towards its confirmation. The implications of the Raven Paradox extend beyond this particular example and raise broader questions about how we generalize from observed instances to universal claims. It highlights the potential pitfalls in our reasoning when we rely solely on formal logic to guide empirical inquiry. The paradox illustrates that even though two statements may be logically equivalent, the ways in which we gather and interpret evidence can lead to very different conclusions about their confirmatory support. This insight has led philosophers and scientists alike to re-examine the methodologies underlying empirical research and the justification of scientific theories. Moreover, the Raven Paradox has inspired a rich discussion about the nature of inductive reasoning itself. Induction involves making generalizations from specific instances, and the paradox shows that such generalizations are fraught with subtle complexities. The idea that a single, seemingly trivial observation can confirm a universal hypothesis challenges the classical view of induction, suggesting that our methods for accumulating evidence and drawing conclusions may need to be more sophisticated than we initially assumed. In response to the paradox, some philosophers advocate for probabilistic approaches to confirmation. Instead of treating each confirming instance as providing an absolute boost to the hypothesis, a probabilistic model would assign a small degree of support to each relevant observation, with the overall confirmation being a cumulative function of these degrees. This probabilistic stance can help explain why a non-black non-raven contributes only marginally to our overall confidence in the hypothesis, thereby aligning more closely with our intuitive sense of relevance and weight. Furthermore, the paradox serves as a reminder that our intuitive notions of evidence and confirmation are not infallible. It exposes the tension between formal logic and empirical practice, urging us to think critically about how we design experiments, interpret data, and ultimately, how we build our scientific knowledge. The Raven Paradox has influenced not only philosophy of science, but also the development of Bayesian models and other statistical approaches that aim to capture the nuanced interplay between evidence and belief. The Abilene Paradox is a striking example of how groups can end up making collective decisions that no individual member truly supports, all because of miscommunication and a deep-seated desire to avoid conflict. The paradox gets its name from a story about a family taking a trip to Abilene, Texas, a trip that no one really wanted to take, but each person assumed that everyone else was enthusiastic about it. In reality, every family member privately wished to stay home, yet they all went along with the plan, ultimately ending up with a decision that was against everyone's actual preferences. At its core, the Abilene Paradox arises from a breakdown in group communication. Group members, fearing that expressing their true desires might lead to confrontation or disrupt group harmony, choose to suppress their genuine opinions. Instead of voicing disagreement, they go along with the perceived group consensus. Over time, this dynamic leads the entire group to commit to a course of action that none of them privately endorses. The result is a kind of collective self-deception. Everyone believes that the decision reflects the group's genuine wishes, when it, in fact, represents a series of compromises and misinterpretations. This phenomenon is particularly common in settings where group cohesion and the avoidance of conflict are highly valued. In many organizations, teams may agree to plans or projects that do not reflect the best interests or true opinions of their members, simply because no one wants to appear contrarian. The paradox thus serves as a powerful reminder of how the desire for consensus can sometimes lead to decisions that are not only suboptimal, but also deeply unsatisfactory for those involved. One of the key factors contributing to the Abilene Paradox is what we might call pluralistic ignorance. This occurs when each member of a group mistakenly believes that their own dissenting opinion is in the minority, even though many others might actually feel the same way. Because everyone is silently harboring doubts or objections, the group collectively moves forward with a decision that is based on a false assumption about mutual support. The failure to openly communicate personal preferences creates an environment where the status quo is maintained, even if it contradicts what most people truly desire. Moreover, the paradox underscores the role of social pressure in group dynamics. People often conform to what they think is the prevailing opinion to avoid the discomfort of conflict or the stigma of being labeled as the one who disrupts harmony. This tendency is reinforced in many cultural and organizational contexts where harmony is prized over honest debate. As a result, individuals might compromise their true opinions, believing that silence or agreement is the safest course of action, even if it leads to a decision that, in hindsight, seems utterly irrational. The implications of the Abilene Paradox extend far beyond the anecdote of a family road trip. In business settings, for example, companies might pursue projects or strategies that are not genuinely supported by their employees, ultimately resulting in wasted resources and missed opportunities for innovation. In political or social groups, the paradox can lead to the reinforcement of policies that do not reflect the true will of the people involved. In each case, the failure to express dissenting opinions not only distorts the decision-making process, but also undermines the overall effectiveness and satisfaction of the group. Addressing the Abilene Paradox requires creating environments where open and honest communication is encouraged, and where dissent is seen as a constructive contribution rather than a threat to group cohesion. Techniques such as anonymous feedback, structured decision-making processes, and a culture that values critical discussion can help mitigate the risk of collective self-deception. By explicitly inviting different viewpoints and making it safe to express minority opinions, groups can avoid the trap of assuming consensus where none exists. In addition, leaders play a crucial role in counteracting the effects of the Abilene Paradox. Effective leaders actively solicit and listen to diverse perspectives, ensuring that every group member feels their opinion is valued. They recognize that true consensus is built on transparent communication, rather than on a superficial agreement that masks underlying disagreements. By fostering an atmosphere where challenging the status quo is not only tolerated but encouraged, leaders can help steer their teams toward decisions that genuinely reflect the collective wisdom and preferences of the group. Reflecting on the Abilene Paradox also invites us to consider our own behavior in group settings. It serves as a reminder that we should be cautious about assuming that silence or passive agreement implies genuine consent. Each of us must be willing to step forward and voice our true opinions, even if they run counter to what we perceive as the popular view. In doing so, we not only contribute to more informed and effective decision-making, but also help create a culture where honest dialogue is the norm rather than the exception. Ultimately, the Abilene Paradox is more than just an interesting quirk of group behavior. It is a powerful illustration of how the interplay of communication, social pressure, and individual insecurity can lead to collective decisions that are at odds with the true preferences of the group. Understanding this paradox challenges us to rethink how we approach group decision-making, emphasizing the importance of transparency, dialogue, and the courage to speak one's mind. As we navigate the complexities of collaborative environments in both our professional and personal lives, recognizing and addressing the Abilene Paradox can lead to more authentic, effective, and satisfying outcomes for everyone involved. The voting paradox is a striking phenomenon in social choice theory, where the collective preference of a group, determined by methods such as majority voting, can become cyclical and inconsistent, even when every individual member has a rational and transitive preference order. This paradox is famously illustrated by Condorcet's paradox, which shows that if voters rank options differently, the group's overall preference can loop endlessly. For instance, imagine 3 candidates, A, B, and C, and a voting scenario in which a majority prefers A over B, another majority prefers B over C, yet a different majority prefers C over A. This cycle means that there is no clear winner even though every voter has a coherent set of preferences. The voting paradox is significant because it reveals an inherent conflict between the ideals of individual rationality and collective decision-making. Each voter may have a clear and consistent ranking, yet when these rankings are aggregated using majority rule, the result can defy rational order. This counterintuitive outcome challenges the assumption that the process of voting inherently leads to a fair or logically consistent group decision. It also poses serious questions about the design of voting systems and the methods used to aggregate individual choices into a collective decision. Historically, the paradox was noted by the Marquis de Condorcet in the 18th century, and it has since become a central example in discussions about the limitations of majority voting. It not only highlights the potential for cyclical majorities, but also serves as a foundation for later work in social choice theory, such as Arrow's impossibility theorem. Arrow's theorem further underscores that no voting system can perfectly convert individual preferences into a collective decision while satisfying a set of seemingly reasonable fairness criteria. The voting paradox, therefore, is not merely a theoretical curiosity, but a fundamental problem that any democratic decision-making process must grapple with. One illustrative example involves 3 policy options. Suppose voters are asked to choose between policy X, policy Y, and policy Z. Imagine that 35% of the voters rank the policies as X greater than Y greater than Z, 33% rank them X greater than Y greater than Z as Y greater than Z greater than X, and 32% rank them as Z greater than X greater than Y. When we compare these pairwise, a majority might prefer X over Y from the 35% and 32% who favor X over Y over Z from the 35% and 33% who favor Y over Z, yet Z over X, from the 33% and 32% who favor Z over X. Despite each voter having a transitive ranking of the options, the group's preference ends up in a cycle. X is preferred to Y is preferred to Z, and yet Z is preferred to X. This cyclicality demonstrates that the method used to aggregate votes can lead to a situation where no single alternative is the unambiguous winner. The implications of this paradox extend beyond theoretical voting scenarios. In practical terms, the voting paradox can lead to instability in collective decision-making. For instance, political elections, committee decisions, or even everyday group choices might end up with outcomes that do not reflect a true consensus. This cyclic inconsistency can undermine the legitimacy of a decision process, as stakeholders may perceive that the chosen option does not represent the actual preferences of the group. Moreover, the paradox invites questions about fairness and the potential manipulation of voting outcomes. If small changes in the order or number of votes can lead to drastically different collective outcomes, then the integrity of the voting process itself may be called into question. Various approaches have been proposed to mitigate the issues highlighted by the voting paradox. Some scholars advocate for alternative voting systems, such as ranked choice voting, board accounts, or approval voting, that attempt to capture a more nuanced picture of voter preferences. Others explore more sophisticated methods of decision-making, like the use of weighted voting or deliberative processes that combine quantitative and qualitative assessments. Despite these efforts, the fundamental challenge remains: aggregating individual, rational preferences into a coherent group decision is fraught with difficulties that are inherent to the mathematics of choice. The voting paradox also serves as a catalyst for broader discussions about democratic theory and the nature of collective will. It raises profound questions about whether a group can ever truly reflect the coherent interests of its individual members, or whether the aggregation process necessarily introduces distortions. These considerations are not only academic, they have real-world consequences for the design of electoral systems, public policy formulation, and the functioning of democratic institutions. In summary, the voting paradox is a powerful illustration of how individual rationality does not always scale neatly into collective rationality. Despite every voter having a consistent ranking of choices, the method of majority voting can lead to a situation where the collective preference is cyclic and lacks a clear winner. This paradox challenges the assumption that democratic decision-making is inherently rational and fair, and it underscores the need for continual refinement of the methods we use to aggregate preferences. By exposing the limitations of traditional voting systems, the voting paradox encourages the search for alternative approaches that can better capture the complexity of collective decision-making. The self-amendment paradox is a fascinating and challenging problem that arises when a formal system, be it a constitution, a set of rules, or even a decision-making algorithm, tries to govern its own capacity for change. At its core, the paradox highlights the tension between flexibility and stability. A system must allow itself to change in order to adapt over time. Yet if it can change its own foundational rules without limitation, it risks undermining the very principles that grant it coherence and legitimacy. One common formulation of the paradox appears in discussions of constitutional design. Consider a constitution that includes a provision detailing how it can be amended. On one hand, this amendment procedure is essential. Without it, the Constitution would be so rigid as to become obsolete in the face of social or political evolution. On the other hand, the very existence of an amendment process implies that no part of the Constitution is absolutely secure. This leads to the puzzling question: can the amendment process itself be amended? If so, what guarantees remain that protect the core values or rights enshrined in the original document? If a self-amending clause allows for its own alteration, then it seems to create a loop where the rules can be continuously redefined, potentially eroding the stability that the Constitution is supposed to ensure. This self-referential loop is at the heart of the paradox. It is reminiscent of other self-reference puzzles, like the liar paradox, where a statement referring to itself produces a contradiction. In the case of self-amendment, if a rule states that no rule in this document may be amended, while also prescribing a method for amendment, then one is forced to confront the contradiction. The document both prohibits and permits change. Conversely, if the document is entirely open to amendment, then any guarantee that protects certain fundamental provisions becomes vulnerable. The paradox, therefore, forces us to balance the need for a mechanism of change with the desire to preserve certain enduring principles. The implications of the self-amendment paradox are significant for both legal theory and practical governance. In constitutional democracies, for instance, debates often arise over whether certain clauses, such as those safeguarding individual rights or limiting governmental power, should be considered unamendable. Proponents argue that without such inviolable cause, a constitution might be eroded over time by transient majorities, potentially leading to tyranny or instability. Critics, however, point out that absolute rigidity can prevent necessary adaptation and may even trap a society under outdated or unjust provisions. The paradox thus highlights the inherent trade-off between safeguarding foundational principles and allowing a system to evolve in response to new circumstances. Beyond constitutional law, the paradox also finds relevance in other areas where self-governance is crucial. In corporate charters, for example, companies often include provisions that restrict how certain key clauses can be amended by requiring supermajority or even unanimous consent. While these restrictions are intended to protect the company's long-term vision or stakeholder interests, they can also create operational rigidity that hinders timely decision-making. In dynamic fields like technology or international law, where conditions change rapidly, designing rules that both protect essential values and remain adaptable is a particularly thorny challenge. Philosophers and theorists have proposed several approaches to address the self-amendment paradox. One strategy is to embrace a tiered or hierarchical structure in which some rules are designated as core or fundamental and are insulated from amendment by ordinary procedures. Only under extraordinary circumstances might these core rules be eligible for change, and even then, the process would be deliberately cumbersome to ensure that such changes reflect a broad consensus. Another approach is to accept a degree of inherent instability as a necessary feature of any self-governing system. Rather than striving for an ideal of absolute finality, this perspective argues that change and reinterpretation are natural parts of a living system, and that over time, the stability of the system emerges from a dynamic balance of forces rather than from an unalterable set of rules. Ultimately, The self-amendment paradox serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities involved in designing systems that must govern themselves. Whether in the realm of law, corporate governance, or even in algorithms that control autonomous systems, the challenge is to craft rules that are flexible enough to accommodate growth and change, while remaining robust enough to preserve the system's essential character. In grappling with this paradox, we are compelled to confront fundamental questions about authority, legitimacy, and the nature of institutional continuity. By exploring the self-amendment paradox, we gain deeper insight into the delicate balance required for any enduring system of governance. It underscores the point that no system can be entirely self-contained or immune to change without also risking its own stability. The paradox invites ongoing dialogue about how best to structure our institutions and rules to navigate the tension between preserving core values and embracing necessary evolution, a tension that lies at the very heart of many modern debates in law, politics, and beyond. The fiction paradox, often referred to as the paradox of fiction, centers on the puzzling phenomenon of how we can experience genuine emotional responses to events, characters, and narratives that we know to be entirely fictional. The fiction paradox is the observation that people often feel deep sadness, joy, fear, or empathy for characters and situations that they are fully aware are not real. This seems paradoxical because our emotional responses are typically thought to be connected to our beliefs about what is true or real. In everyday life, if we feel sorrow over a real loss, it's usually because we believe that loss is actual. However, when it comes to fictional stories, we know on an intellectual level that nothing in the narrative is real, yet our hearts and minds react as if it were. This tension between our cognitive recognition of fictionality and our emotional immersion forms the core of the paradox. One way to approach this puzzle is to consider the nature of our engagement with stories. Many theories suggest that when we read a novel or watch a film, we enter a sort of imaginative space where the usual rules between belief and emotion are temporarily suspended. This imaginative involvement doesn't require us to believe that the events are literally happening. Rather, we suspend disbelief and allow ourselves to feel as though they do. In this framework, our emotions are not necessarily triggered by a belief in the literal truth of the narrative, but by the quality of our imaginative engagement. Yet this explanation raises further questions. If our emotional responses depend solely on imaginative immersion, then why do we continue to be affected even when we consciously remind ourselves that the events are fictional? Some theorists argue that the paradox arises because our cognitive systems are wired to respond to certain narrative cues and empathic signals in a way that bypasses our reflective awareness. In other words, the emotional system can be activated by compelling storytelling, irrespective of the explicit knowledge that the content is fabricated. This suggests a kind of dual processing system, one that is fast, intuitive, and effective, and another that is slower, reflective, and cognitive. The fiction paradox challenges us to reconcile these two modes of processing. Another interesting perspective is provided by proponents of a fiction as simulation theory. According to this view, engaging with fiction is similar to running a mental simulation. Just as we might imagine the outcomes of events in our own lives, we simulate the lives of fictional characters. The simulation feels real on an emotional level, even though we know it's not. This helps explain why we can feel genuine emotions, like grief over a character's death, even when we know the character is imaginary. The simulation is vivid enough to trigger our empathic responses, blurring the line between actual experience and representational experience. Critics of these accounts point out that while they may explain the mechanism of our emotional reactions, they do not fully resolve the paradox. If our emotions are elicited by simulation or immersion, then why should these responses be as strong as those triggered by real events? Some argue that the paradox highlights a gap in our understanding of emotional cognition, suggesting that our affective responses are not solely determined by the veridical status of our beliefs, but are also influenced by context, narrative coherence, and even aesthetic appreciation. The fiction paradox also has broader implications for the philosophy of art and literature. It calls into question the criteria we use to evaluate the impact of art. If the power of fiction lies partly in its ability to evoke emotions regardless of its factual status, then the aesthetic value of a work might be understood in terms of its capacity to engage these dual layers of human experience, the cognitive and the affective. This realization can reshape our approach to both creating and critiquing art, suggesting that the interplay between belief, imagination, and emotion is central to what makes art meaningful. Moreover, the paradox invites us to explore how cultural and individual differences affect our engagement with fiction. Not everyone responds to the same narrative in the same way, and factors such as personal experience, empathy, and even neurobiological predispositions can modulate how deeply we are moved by a story. In this light, the fiction paradox is not a one-size-fits-all problem, but a rich field for investigating the diversity of human emotional life and the various ways in which fiction can serve as a mirror to our inner selves. Additionally, some philosophers have proposed that the paradox might be resolved by distinguishing between different kinds of emotions. For example, the sorrow felt in response to a real-world tragedy might differ qualitatively from the sadness experienced when reading a novel. The latter could be seen as a kind of quasi-emotion, a response that is genuine but less intense or consequential than emotions tied to reality. This distinction, however, remains controversial, as many would argue that the emotions triggered by fiction can be as profound and life-changing as those evoked by real events. Ultimately, the fiction paradox challenges us to rethink the relationship between truth and emotion. It suggests that our emotional lives are not strictly governed by the objective reality of events, but also by the imaginative frameworks we construct to make sense of our experiences. The paradox reminds us that art, in its capacity to evoke genuine feeling, operates on a level that transcends the simple dichotomy of true versus false. In doing so, it invites us to embrace a more nuanced understanding of how narrative, imagination, and emotion interweave to enrich our human experience. The Drowning Child Paradox is a powerful moral thought experiment that challenges us to confront the limits of our ethical obligations and the discrepancies between our ideals and our everyday actions. Imagine walking along a calm road when you suddenly notice a child struggling in a shallow pond nearby. Most of us would agree, almost without hesitation, that you should jump in and rescue the child, even if doing so means ruining your expensive clothes or being late for an important appointment. The starkness of this scenario forces us to question if saving a life in such an immediate and concrete situation is a moral imperative. How does that obligation extend to less immediate more abstract forms of suffering in the world. At its core, the paradox lays bare the idea that if we accept saving the drowning child as a duty because the cost to us is minor compared to the value of the child's life, then, by similar reasoning, we should be compelled to make significant sacrifices to help those suffering from poverty, disease, or famine across the globe. The immediate visual and emotional impact of a drowning child triggers our natural empathy, demanding an urgent response. In contrast, the suffering of distant strangers, while morally equivalent in many respects, rarely mobilizes the same instantaneous reaction because it is less vivid and immediate in our daily experience. This disparity between our intuitive response to a nearby crisis and our often tepid reaction to remote suffering is at the heart of the drowning child paradox. It raises deep questions about the nature of moral obligation and the factors that shape our willingness to help. On the one hand, our ethical principles, when stripped down to their logical essence, suggest that if we can prevent something terrible from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral value, then we ought to do so. On the other hand, human psychology is influenced by proximity, emotional immediacy, and personal involvement, factors that can cloud our ability to consistently apply these principles on a larger scale. Philosophers like Peter Singer have famously used this paradox to argue for a more demanding view of morality. Singer suggests that if we truly believe that every human life has equal value, then our moral responsibilities extend far beyond the immediate circle of our family, friends, and local community. According to this line of thought, the same moral reasoning that compels us to jump into the pond should also compel us to donate a significant portion of our income to alleviate global suffering. Yet, while the logic is clear in theory, in practice, most people find it psychologically challenging to reconcile with their everyday behaviors. This tension between ethical theory and lived experience is what makes the paradox so compelling and difficult to resolve. Moreover, the paradox invites us to examine the role of effective altruism, a philosophical and social movement that advocates for using evidence and reason to determine the most effective ways to benefit others. Proponents of effective altruism argue that we should base our charitable actions on the impact our resources can have, regardless of geographical or emotional distance. In this view, if one is willing to sacrifice a small personal convenience to save a drowning child, one should also be willing to make similar, proportionate sacrifices to fund interventions that save lives in distant parts of the world. However, the practical reality is that the immediacy of a local emergency, like a drowning child, generates a much stronger emotional drive than the abstract calculations of cost-effectiveness applied to global crises. Another layer of the paradox lies in our cognitive biases. Psychological studies have shown that people are more likely to help when they feel a direct connection or when the need is vividly presented. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to as the identifiable victim effect, means that a single, identifiable child in distress can elicit a stronger response than statistical victims who remain nameless and faceless. Our natural empathy is triggered by concrete images and stories, and it is far less activated by abstract numbers and distant tragedies, even though, logically, both scenarios should warrant an equal moral response. The drowning child paradox thus forces us to critically evaluate the gap between our moral ideals and our actual behavior. It challenges us to consider whether our ethical systems are truly universal or if they are compromised by human limitations, such as emotional distance and psychological inertia. While many of us might endorse the principle that saving a life is paramount, the paradox reveals how rarely we apply that principle consistently in our daily lives when confronted with less immediate forms of suffering. In grappling with this paradox, one is led to a broader reflection on the nature of moral responsibility in a globalized world. It questions the fairness of a moral system that on paper demands great sacrifices for the sake of alleviating suffering, yet in practice allows for significant discrepancies between what we believe and what we do. This dissonance not only exposes the limitations of our moral psychology, but also invites us to explore ways to bridge the gap between our high-minded ethical principles and our day-to-day actions. Ultimately, the drowning child paradox serves as both a moral critique and a call to action. It challenges each of us to examine our own lives and to consider how much we are willing to sacrifice for the sake of others. It reminds us that the demands of moral consistency might be far greater than we are prepared to accept, yet it also offers an opportunity to rethink and potentially reform our ethical frameworks. In recognizing the tension between our immediate impulses and our broader moral commitments, we are invited to cultivate a more coherent and compassionate approach to the many forms of suffering that exist in our interconnected world. The Newcomb's paradox is a classic thought experiment in decision theory that pits two seemingly rational strategies against each other, challenging our intuitive notions of choice, prediction, and free will. In the standard formulation, you are presented with two boxes. Box B is transparent and clearly contains a fixed amount, say $1,000, while Box A is opaque and its content is uncertain. A highly reliable predictor who has an impressive track record of accurately forecasting your actions has already made a prediction about whether you will choose only Box A or both boxes. The twist is this: if the predictor has forecast that you will choose only Box A, then Box A contains $1 million. If the prediction is that you will take both boxes, then Box A is left empty. You must now decide whether to take both boxes or just Box A. On one hand, a common argument known as two-boxing follows a straightforward line of thought. Since the money in Box A has already been determined by the time you make your choice, taking Box B as well is a free addition. From this perspective, no matter what the predictor has already done, taking both boxes guarantees an extra $1,000. This reasoning is rooted in what decision theorists call the dominance principle. If one option always yields more money, regardless of the predictor's past, then that option should be chosen. On the other hand, there is the one-boxing strategy, which argues that since the predictor is nearly infallible, your choice is strongly correlated with what is in Box A. In other words, if you are the kind of person who chooses only Box A, it is almost certain that the predictor anticipated this, and Box A would then contain the $1 million. This approach leans on the idea of evidential decision theory. Your action is seen as evidence of your type or disposition, which in turn has already influenced the predictor's earlier decision. Thus, by choosing only Box A, you align yourself with the outcome that yields the higher reward. This apparent conflict between the two strategies encapsulates the paradox. The two boxers argue that because the money is already in the boxes, your choice now cannot alter what is there, so taking both boxes is the safe bet. In contrast, one boxers emphasize that if you consistently act as though you will only take Box A, the predictor's near-perfect accuracy means that you are more likely to end up with the $1 million. The puzzle forces us to re-examine what it means to cause an outcome when a prediction about your behavior is already made, and whether the predictor's record should influence the rationality of your decision. The debate over Newcomb's paradox also touches on deeper philosophical issues such as free will and determinism. Some see the paradox as a challenge to the idea that our decisions are free in the conventional sense. If a predictor can nearly always foresee your choice, then in what sense are you free to choose? Others argue that the paradox merely highlights the tension between two different models of rationality: causal decision theory, which focuses on the direct effects of your actions, and evidential decision theory, which considers what your choice implies about your nature. In exploring Newcomb's paradox, we are forced to confront questions about how we evaluate probabilities, how we weigh immediate gains against larger potential rewards, and even how our understanding of cause and effect might be more complex than it appears at first glance. The paradox has inspired extensive debate among philosophers, economists, and cognitive scientists, each trying to reconcile the conflict between the seemingly dominant strategy of taking both boxes and the compelling logic of one boxing. What makes Newcomb's paradox particularly intriguing is that it does not offer an easy resolution. Instead, it serves as a focal point for discussions about the nature of rationality itself. The paradox illustrates that the methods we use to make decisions, whether by strictly following the dominance principle or by considering the evidence provided by our own nature, can lead to dramatically different recommendations. In a broader sense, Newcomb's paradox challenges us to think about how we act under uncertainty, and whether the ideal of maximizing expected utility can sometimes conflict with other, perhaps more intuitively appealing, ways of reasoning. Ultimately, Newcomb's paradox remains a potent thought experiment because it forces us to examine our assumptions about choice, prediction, and the rationality of our actions. Whether one ultimately sides with the one boxers or the two boxers, the paradox compels us to reflect on how our decisions are intertwined with the information available about us, the role of prediction in shaping outcomes, and the intricate dance between free will and determinism. It is this rich interplay of ideas that continues to fuel discussions about decision theory and the philosophy of mind, making Newcomb's paradox one of the most enduring puzzles in contemporary thought. The Borel Paradox is a surprising and subtle phenomenon that arises in the realm of probability theory and measure theory, particularly when one attempts to condition on events of measure zero. To illustrate, imagine a sphere with a uniform probability distribution over its surface. Now, suppose we try to condition on the event that a randomly chosen point lies exactly on a given line of longitude, an event that, under the continuous area measure of the sphere, has probability 0. The paradox emerges because the result of this conditioning appears to depend on the coordinate system or the limiting process used to approach the measure zero set. In one formulation, if you express the sphere in spherical coordinates, you might find that the conditional distribution over the remaining coordinate, say the azimuthal angle, turns out to be uniform. However, if you reparameterize the sphere using a different coordinate system, one that might involve, for instance, projecting the sphere onto a plane, the same conditioning can lead to a non-uniform distribution over the corresponding variable. This counterintuitive outcome challenges our standard expectations from probability theory. Normally, one would expect that conditioning on a particular event, even if it is of measure zero, should yield a unique and coordinate-independent result. Yet the Borel Paradox demonstrates that without careful specification of how the conditioning is defined via a limiting process, the answer is ambiguous. This reveals a deep conceptual issue. The act of conditioning on events that have zero probability is not as straightforward as it might initially seem, and it underscores the importance of how limits and approximations are handled in the mathematical formulation of probability. The paradox can be understood better by considering that when you condition on an event of measure zero, you are essentially asking what the probability distribution would be if you could zoom in on an infinitely thin slice of your sample space. However, since there is no natural width to this slice, the answer can depend on the manner in which you approach it. In the case of the sphere, if one uses the natural area measure and conditions on a fixed polar angle, one might obtain one result. Yet if one approaches the problem by first considering a band of small but positive measure around that angle, and then taking a limit as the band shrinks, different choices in how to shrink the band can lead to different limiting distributions. In other words, the paradox reveals that the concept of a conditional probability given a zero probability event is inherently sensitive to the method of approximation chosen. This sensitivity has significant implications, both philosophically and mathematically. Philosophically, the Borel Paradox forces us to reconsider what we mean by conditional probability when the condition itself is an event that almost surely does not occur. It raises questions about the objectivity of probability assignments and about how much of our probabilistic intuitions are artifacts of the coordinate system or the method used to describe the system. Mathematically, it has led to a more careful development of conditional probability theory in the context of measure theory, notably through the concept of regular conditional probabilities. These advanced formulations aim to define conditional probabilities in a way that avoids the ambiguities highlighted by the paradox, but they also reveal the limits of our standard intuitions when dealing with infinite or continuous spaces. Moreover, the Borel Paradox is a striking example of how classical probability, which works so well in discrete cases, can become counterintuitive when extended to continuous cases. It serves as a cautionary tale that one must be vigilant when extending definitions from the finite or countable realm to the uncountable. For instance, while it is perfectly clear what it means to condition on a single outcome in a finite sample space, in the continuous case, there is no single, correct answer without additional structure. This is why the paradox is not just an abstract curiosity, but a fundamental issue that has driven further research into how we define and interpret probabilities in continuous settings. In practical applications, this paradox reminds statisticians and scientists to carefully consider the assumptions underlying their models, especially when conditioning on events that are extremely unlikely, or when using coordinate transformations. The lesson is that our conclusions can be sensitive to subtle choices in our mathematical framework, and that these choices can have real-world consequences when making predictions or interpreting data. Ultimately, the Borel Paradox exemplifies the delicate interplay between mathematics and intuition. It challenges us to accept that some aspects of probability theory, especially in the context of infinite or continuous systems, may defy our everyday expectations. By forcing us to confront these issues, The paradox has enriched our understanding of conditional probability and led to more robust and nuanced mathematical formulations. It serves as a reminder that in the world of advanced mathematics, even seemingly obvious concepts can hide profound subtleties that only become apparent upon close and careful analysis. Bertrand's paradox is a fascinating puzzle in probability theory that challenges our intuition about randomness in a continuous setting. Imagine a circle and consider the following question. What is the probability that a randomly drawn chord in this circle is longer than the side of an inscribed equilateral triangle? At first, this may sound like a straightforward question, but Bertrand demonstrated that different methods of defining a random chord lead to different answers, namely 1/3, 1/2, or 1/4. One way to choose a random chord is by selecting 2 points independently and uniformly on the circumference of the circle and connecting them. Using this method, the probability that the chord is longer than the side of the inscribed triangle turns out to be 1/3. The idea is that if you measure the angular separation between the two endpoints, only a certain fraction of those separations will result in a chord that is long enough. Alternatively, consider a different approach. First, choose a random radius, then select a point along that radius uniformly, and finally, draw a chord perpendicular to that radius at that point. With this method, the probability of obtaining a chord longer than the side of the triangle comes out to be 1/2. Here, the random variable is the distance from the center along the chosen radius, and a simple geometric calculation shows that chords drawn from points closer to the center are longer, leading to a different outcome. A third method involves picking the midpoint of the chord uniformly from the area of the circle. Under this approach, the probability is calculated to be 1/4. The reasoning behind this method is that a chord will be longer than the triangle's side if and only if its midpoint lies within a particular inner circle. The area of this inner circle, relative to the area of the whole circle, determines the probability. What makes Bertrand's paradox so intriguing is that each method appears reasonable, yet they yield incompatible results. This discrepancy forces us to re-examine our concept of randomness. In discrete probability, the idea of a uniformly random choice is often clear-cut. However, in continuous spaces, uniform can depend on the specific measure or coordinate system chosen to model the situation. Essentially, Bertrand's paradox tells us that without a clear specification of the method for random selection, the very question we ask becomes ambiguous. The implications of this paradox extend far beyond a single geometric puzzle. It highlights a fundamental issue in probability theory. When dealing with infinite or continuous sets, our intuitive ideas about uniformity and randomness require precise definitions. Mathematicians resolve such ambiguities by carefully defining measures that capture the intended notion of randomness. For instance, if one adopts the principle of invariance under rotations or translations, it may guide the choice of a particular measure. However, in Bertrand's original problem, no single measure is canonically correct without additional context or constraints. Philosophically, Bertrand's paradox challenges the objectivity of probability assignments. Should there be one correct answer to the probability question, or is the answer inherently dependent on our arbitrary choices in modeling? This question has influenced later work in both probability theory and the philosophy of science, prompting researchers to examine how mathematical formalism and intuitive reasoning interact when we attempt to model real-world uncertainties. In practical terms, the paradox serves as a cautionary tale for anyone working with probabilistic models, particularly in fields like physics, economics, or computer science. It reminds us that assumptions we make, often implicitly, about how to distribute randomness can have significant consequences on our conclusions. When developing models, one must carefully justify the chosen method of randomization, especially in continuous scenarios, to avoid inadvertently introducing ambiguity or bias. Bertrand's paradox ultimately underscores the delicate balance between mathematical rigor and intuitive appeal. It teaches us that our understanding of randomness is not as straightforward as it may seem. The paradox compels us to look deeper into the foundations of probability, to ask what we really mean by random, and to recognize that in the realm of continuous mathematics, the way we pose a problem is just as important as the solution itself. In summary, Bertrand's paradox is not just a curiosity, it is a profound reminder that seemingly simple questions can reveal hidden complexities. Whether you approach the problem by choosing endpoints, midpoints, or other methods, the outcome depends critically on how you define your randomness. This insight enriches our understanding of probability theory and reminds us that careful definitions are essential when translating intuitive ideas into precise mathematical language. The Skolem Paradox is a thought-provoking phenomenon in mathematical logic and set theory that arises from a tension between our intuitive notions of size, particularly regarding infinite sets, and the limitations imposed by first-order logic. In set theory, particularly in systems like Zermelo-Frenkel set theory with the axiom of choice, ZFC, we prove the existence of uncountable sets, such as the set of real numbers. Uncountable here means that these sets cannot be put into a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. However, the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem tells us that if a first-order theory has an infinite model, then it also has a countable model. Consequently, there exists a countable model of ZFC, in which, from an external perspective, every element of the model can be listed in a sequence, even though, within the model, the set of reals is defined as uncountable. This situation appears paradoxical because it seems to suggest that a model which, by our external viewpoint, is countable, still believes that it contains uncountable sets. The resolution lies in the fact that notions like countable and uncountable are internal to the model. Within any given model of ZFC, a set is considered uncountable if there is no bijection or one-to-one correspondence between that set and the model's copy of the natural numbers. However, from the outside, we can see that the entire model, including its uncountable sets, is countable. The paradox highlights that countability is a relative concept. It depends on the framework from which you observe the set. The Skolem Paradox thus illustrates a fundamental limitation of first-order logic. First-order theories, by their very nature, cannot pin down a unique notion of size or infinity when it comes to infinite structures. This is because the expressive power of first-order logic is too weak to capture all the nuances of set-theoretic concepts. In other words, while set theory as formulated in ZFC can prove the existence of uncountable sets, any model of ZFC expressed in first-order logic can be shrunk to a countable model from an external perspective. Yet inside this model, all the usual theorems about uncountability still hold, because the model's internal definition of a bijection does not include the external enumeration. Philosophically, the Skolem Paradox has significant implications for our understanding of mathematical truth. It challenges the idea that there is a single, absolute universe of sets. Instead, it reveals that there can be many models of set theory, each internally coherent and satisfying the same axioms, even though they may look very different from an external standpoint. This plurality of models gives rise to debates about mathematical realism versus formalism. Do mathematical objects have an existence independent of the models we construct, or are they simply artifacts of the formal systems we use? Moreover, the paradox invites reflection on the nature of our intuitive concepts of infinity. Our everyday understanding of uncountable seems absolute, yet the Skolem Paradox shows that even such a seemingly clear-cut concept can become ambiguous when viewed through the lens of formal logic. It demonstrates that our intuitive ideas about size and infinity may not be fully captured by any single formal system, highlighting the subtle interplay between syntax, the formal rules and structures of a theory, and semantics, the meaning or interpretation of those structures. In practical terms, the Skolem Paradox has spurred further developments in model theory and the study of non-standard models. By revealing that first-order theories can have models that are counterintuitive from an external perspective, mathematicians have been motivated to develop more robust frameworks for understanding the foundations of mathematics. Concepts like internal versus external perspective and the search for invariant properties under model transformations are central to ongoing research in this area. Ultimately, the Skolem Paradox is not a flaw in set theory or logic, but rather a window into the rich and sometimes counterintuitive nature of infinite structures. It reminds us that even rigorous mathematical theories can yield surprises when we scrutinize the relationship between formal language and intuitive concepts. The paradox continues to influence philosophical debates about the nature of mathematical existence and remains a central topic in discussions of the limits and power of formal systems. The Predictability Paradox is a fascinating phenomenon that arises when our efforts to forecast or control a system end up altering its behavior in unexpected ways, often rendering our predictions less reliable or even self-defeating. In essence, it is the idea that in certain complex or adaptive systems, the very act of predicting the future can change the future itself. To understand the paradox, imagine a scenario in which a reliable forecast is made about an economic downturn. If enough market participants believe this prediction, they might begin to act in ways that either trigger the downturn or, conversely, take measures to avoid it. In the first case, their collective actions might fulfill the forecast, while in the second, those same actions might completely undermine the prediction. This dual possibility, that predictions can be self-fulfilling or self-defeating, captures the heart of the Predictability Paradox. One of the core challenges is that many systems, be they economic, social, or even environmental, are composed of agents who adjust their behavior based on the information available to them. When a prediction becomes common knowledge, these agents may change their actions in response, which can shift the system's dynamics. For example, consider public policy. If the government announces a prediction of severe congestion in a city, commuters might change their travel routes or schedules, potentially diffusing the anticipated gridlock. In this way, the original prediction alters behavior so significantly that the expected outcome is averted. This paradox also appears in scientific contexts, particularly in complex systems where feedback loops and emergent properties play crucial roles. In weather forecasting or climate modeling, for instance, the models are based on probabilities and historical data. However, if the forecasts are widely disseminated, they might lead to changes in human activity, like altering energy consumption patterns or agricultural practices, that in turn affect the very climate conditions being predicted. Thus, while the models aim to provide reliable forecasts, their predictions can inadvertently become part of the system they seek to describe, introducing layers of complexity and uncertainty. Moreover, the Predictability Paradox challenges the traditional notion that better prediction always leads to better outcomes. In some cases, increased predictability might lead to overconfidence, encouraging risky behaviors that ultimately destabilize the system. For instance, in financial markets, the widespread belief in a particular forecast can result in herding behavior among investors. This collective action might inflate asset bubbles or trigger abrupt market corrections, phenomena that are hardly predicted by the original models. The paradox reminds us that the dynamics of anticipation and reaction are often intertwined in ways that defy simple cause and effect logic. Another intriguing aspect of the paradox is its impact on decision theory and policy making. When decision makers know that their predictions can influence behavior, they are forced to account for these feedback effects. This has led to the development of more sophisticated models that try to incorporate not just the outcomes, but also the responses of agents to those outcomes. In economic theory, for example, the Lucas critique highlights that policy evaluations based on historical relationships may fail when the underlying behavior of economic agents changes in response to new policies, a perspective that resonates strongly with the ideas underlying the Predictability Paradox. Philosophically, the paradox raises questions about free will and determinism. If our predictions can alter the outcomes they forecast, to what extent are those outcomes truly determined by the inherent properties of the system? And to what extent are they the result of human interpretation and intervention? This line of inquiry pushes us to reconsider our understanding of causality in systems where human behavior and natural processes are deeply intertwined. In summary, the Predictability Paradox illustrates that in adaptive systems, our ability to foresee the future is not independent of our influence on that future, whether in economics, environmental science, or everyday decision-making. The act of predicting can set off a chain reaction of responses that either confirm or contradict the original forecast. This paradox serves as a powerful reminder that the world is often more dynamic and interconnected than our models might suggest, and that the interplay between prediction and behavior is a key factor in understanding complex systems. The Omniscience Paradox is a multifaceted problem in philosophy and theology that centers on the tension between divine or absolute omniscience and the notion of human free will. Here's a detailed exploration. The Omniscience Paradox challenges us to reconcile the idea of an all-knowing being with the reality of human freedom. If an omniscient entity knows every event that will ever occur, including every human decision, then it appears that all events are predetermined. This raises the difficult question: if our choices are already known in advance, can we truly be said to exercise free will? On the one hand, the notion of omniscience suggests complete foreknowledge, implying that every future action is fixed in the mind of the omniscient being. On the other hand, our everyday experience insists that we have genuine control over our actions, and that our decisions are not pre-written. One way philosophers have attempted to resolve this paradox is by rethinking the nature of time and knowledge. Some argue that omniscience does not necessarily require foreknowledge in a temporal sense. That is, an omniscient being might know all truths without predicting the future in the way humans do. Instead, such a being might have a timeless or a temporal perspective, where past, present, and future are seen as a whole. In this view, what we consider future decisions are simply part of a complete and eternal tapestry of events, and the omniscient being's knowledge does not interfere with our capacity to choose, because the concept of time is different from our linear experience. Another perspective comes from compatibilist approaches in the free will debate. Compatibilists hold that free will and determinism can coexist. Applied to the Omniscience Paradox, this means that even if our actions are, in some sense, predetermined or fully known by an omniscient being, we can still be said to act freely as long as our choices arise from our internal motivations and are not coerced. The fact that a being knows what we will choose doesn't cause our choice. Rather, our choice remains an expression of our character and reasoning, even though it is part of a larger, predetermined framework. Critics, however, argue that this solution seems to sidestep the core tension. If every decision is known in advance, then it might appear that the possibility of alternative actions is illusory. The paradox thus forces us to consider the meaning of alternative in a context where all events are interwoven in an eternal, complete order. Some theologians propose that omniscience encompasses not only what will happen, but also what could happen, capturing not just a single timeline, but the full range of potentialities. This counterfactual omniscience suggests that an omniscient being might know all outcomes of every possible decision, yet still allow agents to choose freely among them. Although conceptually challenging, this idea attempts to preserve the integrity of free will while maintaining divine foreknowledge. Another angle is to question whether our human notions of causality and temporality are applicable to an omniscient perspective. It may be that our linear conceptions are inadequate for describing a reality where the ultimate knowledge is holistic and non-sequential. In such a framework, the future is not open in the human sense, yet individuals still experience making choices. The omniscient being's comprehensive knowledge then exists on a different level, a meta-level that doesn't constrain the lived reality of decision-making. The implications of the Omniscience Paradox extend beyond abstract philosophy. In theological contexts, it touches on issues of divine justice and mercy. If God knows everything that will happen, how can humans be held accountable for their actions? Some traditions argue that divine omniscience coexists with a kind of moral freedom, where humans are responsible for their choices even if those choices are foreknown. This invites a re-examination of the nature of responsibility, suggesting that accountability might be grounded not in the unpredictability of our actions, but in the integrity and authenticity of the decision-making process. Moreover, the paradox influences debates on determinism versus indeterminism. If the future is fully known, then the universe might seem like a closed system without genuine novelty. Yet many argue that even in a fully determined framework, the subjective experience of making choices and the emergence of new situations remain vital aspects of life. In this light, the Omniscience Paradox isn't a refutation of free will, but a challenge to expand our understanding of what it means to know, decide, and be free. In summary, the Omniscience Paradox forces us to confront some of the deepest questions about knowledge, time, and freedom. It challenges the apparent conflict between an all-knowing perspective and the experience of free choice by inviting us to rethink the nature of temporal knowledge, consider the possibility of a timeless or atemporal viewpoint, and explore compatible resolutions that allow for free will even in a fully determined framework. Whether one leans toward a theological, philosophical, or scientific explanation, the paradox remains a central puzzle in our quest to understand the intricate relationship between determinism, foreknowledge, and the human capacity for choice. The generosity paradox is the counterintuitive observation that acts of giving, though they might seem to involve a short-term sacrifice of one's own resources, often lead to benefits that far exceed the apparent cost. On the surface, generosity can appear self-defeating. Why would someone willingly part with money, time, or effort when self-interest would suggest that conserving resources is the optimal strategy? Yet, numerous studies in psychology, economics, and even evolutionary biology indicate that generous behavior tends to yield long-term rewards, both for the individual and for society as a whole. At its heart, the paradox challenges the conventional economic notion of the rational actor, who is expected to maximize personal gain. Traditional models would predict that giving away resources diminishes one's own wealth or well-being. However, empirical evidence suggests that people who are generous often experience increased happiness, improved health, and stronger social connections. This phenomenon may be explained by several interrelated factors. For one, generous acts tend to foster social bonds and trust. When you give, you signal cooperation and reliability, which encourages reciprocity. In turn, this builds social capital, a kind of currency that can result in future favors, support during times of need, and even opportunities that might not have been available otherwise. Another explanation comes from the realm of psychology. Studies on the helper's high reveal that acts of generosity trigger the release of endorphins, producing a genuine feeling of well-being. This neurochemical reward system can make the act of giving intrinsically pleasurable. Moreover, generous behavior can enhance self-esteem and provide a sense of purpose, both of which contribute to overall life satisfaction. In this way, generosity transforms what might initially be seen as a sacrifice into an investment in one's own emotional and physical health. From an evolutionary standpoint, the generosity paradox also finds support in the concept of reciprocal altruism. In many animal species, including humans, behaviors that benefit others, even at a cost to oneself, can be advantageous over the long term if they lead to reciprocal actions. Evolutionary biologists argue that natural selection may favor individuals who are predisposed to help others because such behavior strengthens group cohesion and increases the chances of survival in a cooperative community. Thus, generosity can be seen as an adaptive trait that benefits both the individual and the collective. Yet another dimension of the paradox lies in the way generous actions can create a self-reinforcing cycle. When individuals act generously, they often inspire similar behavior in others. This cascading effect can lead to a culture of giving, where the benefits of generosity multiply across the community. In such environments, acts of kindness are not isolated events, but are part of a larger social network that reinforces pro-social behavior, leading to greater societal resilience and overall prosperity. The paradox becomes especially striking when we consider that the benefits of generosity are not always immediately obvious. The positive effects, improved mental health, stronger relationships, and enhanced social reputation, may take time to manifest, yet they accumulate and often prove to be more valuable than the initial resource outlay. For example, a philanthropist might donate a significant sum to a cause without expecting any direct financial return, but the resulting goodwill can lead to new opportunities, partnerships, and a legacy of impact that enriches both personal fulfillment and community well-being. Critics of the paradox might argue that generosity also carries risks. For instance, excessive giving could leave an individual vulnerable to exploitation or financial hardship. However, research indicates that the benefits of measured generosity, when practiced in balance with self-care, tend to outweigh the potential downsides. In many cases, those who are known for their generosity find that they are not only less likely to be taken advantage of, but also more likely to be trusted and supported by their peers. This suggests that generosity, far from being a self-destructive impulse, is actually a sophisticated strategy for long-term social and personal success. The generosity paradox also invites us to reconsider our cultural narratives about wealth and success. In societies where material accumulation is often seen as the highest achievement, the idea that giving away resources could lead to greater fulfillment challenges deeply held beliefs about self-interest. In contrast, a growing body of research in positive psychology demonstrates that individuals who prioritize relationships and community over mere accumulation of wealth tend to report higher levels of happiness and life satisfaction. In this light, the paradox serves as a powerful reminder that true prosperity is not measured solely in financial terms, but also in the richness of one's connections and contributions to the greater good. Ultimately, the generosity paradox forces us to confront a deeper truth about human nature, that our well-being is inextricably linked to our social interactions and our willingness to share with others. What might appear as a loss on the surface, whether it be money, time, or energy, can, in the long run, yield returns that far surpass the original investment. In a world where self-interest is often seen as the driving force of progress, the paradox of generosity offers a compelling counter-narrative. It reminds us that when we give, we often receive much more in return, whether in the form of emotional satisfaction, social trust, or even unexpected opportunities. In summary, the generosity paradox encapsulates the idea that the act of giving, while seemingly costly in the short term, frequently leads to benefits that are both personal and communal. It challenges traditional notions of self-interest by showing that generosity can be a highly effective strategy for achieving long-term happiness, improved health, and stronger social bonds. By rethinking what it means to be generous, we come to appreciate that our greatest gains often come not from hoarding resources, but from sharing them with others. The collective responsibility paradox is a thought-provoking dilemma in ethics and moral philosophy that examines the difficulty of assigning moral blame or praise to groups when individual contributions are either diluted or indistinguishable. Imagine a large organization or society where numerous individuals contribute small actions that cumulatively lead to a significant outcome, whether harmful or beneficial. The paradox arises because, on one hand, we intuitively feel that the group as a whole should be held accountable for the collective outcome. Yet, on the other hand, if every single member's contribution is minor, it becomes challenging to pinpoint any individual as morally culpable, or conversely, as uniquely praiseworthy. In other words, while the aggregate behavior might be condemnable, each member might claim that their personal impact was negligible. a kind of diffusion of responsibility. This tension is often illustrated by what some refer to as the problem of many hands. In scenarios such as corporate scandals, environmental degradation, or even military operations, a harmful outcome is produced by the combined actions of many people. The collective may be subject to legal or moral judgment, but when asked to identify who is at fault, it becomes difficult to hold any one individual fully responsible. This creates a paradox. If everyone argues that their individual role was too small to matter, then logically, none of them should be blamed. Yet the group's overall actions have led to a serious wrong. One way to understand this paradox is to consider the notion of moral responsibility as it applies to groups versus individuals. Traditional views on responsibility assume that agents are singular entities whose actions can be clearly attributed and evaluated. However, when actions are distributed among a multitude of people, the responsibility becomes a collective phenomenon that does not neatly reduce to the sum of individual responsibilities. For instance, if a company pollutes a river, no single employee may have made the decision to discharge toxic waste. Instead, it was the outcome of policies and practices approved at various levels. Still, the public and legal systems tend to hold the corporation accountable as an entity, even though the culpability of any one person remains murky. The paradox also challenges us to consider whether moral responsibility should be seen as strictly individual or as inherently collective. Some philosophers argue that even if individual contributions are minimal, the group's decision-making process and institutional structures can create a collective moral agent that deserves responsibility. Others maintain that unless each individual is directly responsible for the decision, attributing collective blame might be unfair. This debate becomes particularly acute in modern complex societies, where actions are often the result of distributed processes. Think of how millions of small actions contribute to climate change. Each person's contribution may seem trivial, yet the combined effect is enormous, raising the question, should every individual be held responsible for a problem as vast as global warming, or is it more appropriate to target the collective institutions that shape these behaviors? Furthermore, the collective responsibility paradox touches on the practical implications of how we enforce justice and accountability. In legal systems, for instance, collective crimes such as corporate fraud or war crimes are prosecuted against the entity or group rather than just the individuals. This approach acknowledges that while the harm is collective, punishing every minor participant might be impractical or unjust. Yet, if no one is held personally accountable, individuals may feel less compelled to act responsibly, creating what is sometimes called a moral free ride problem. At the same time, the paradox can also have positive connotations when it comes to commendable collective actions. For example, when a community comes together to help those in need, the collective achievement can be celebrated even if no single act of kindness stands out on its own. In such cases, recognizing collective responsibility can foster a sense of solidarity and encourage cooperative behavior, even as it complicates our understanding of individual merit. In grappling with the collective responsibility paradox, scholars have proposed several resolutions. Some suggest that we need a more nuanced account of responsibility, one that incorporates degrees of responsibility rather than an all-or-nothing approach. Others propose that responsibility should be tied to the capacity for influence. Individuals or subgroups who have greater power in decision-making should bear a larger share of the blame or praise. Still, others argue that the concept of collective agency should be refined so that groups can be seen as moral subjects in their own right, separate from the mere sum of individual actions. Ultimately, the paradox forces us to reconsider how we think about responsibility in complex systems. It highlights that in today's interconnected world, moral and legal accountability is rarely as simple as pointing a finger at a single individual. Instead, we must develop frameworks that recognize the intricate web of contributions that lead to collective outcomes, whether those outcomes are beneficial or harmful. By doing so, we may better address issues ranging from corporate ethics to global challenges like climate change, ensuring that both individual actions and collective structures are held to appropriate standards of responsibility. The subjectivity of perception. Paradox is a philosophical puzzle that questions how we can claim a shared, objective reality when every individual experiences the world through a uniquely subjective lens. At its core, the paradox arises from the tension between the belief in an external, objective world and the understanding that our perceptions of that world are filtered through our personal sensory apparatus, cognitive frameworks, and emotional states. When we look at the world, our senses gather raw data from our environment, but what we actually experience is a constructed representation, a mental image shaped by factors like past experiences, cultural background, and even neurological differences. For example, consider color perception. Two people may both call the sky blue, yet the internal experience of that color could be remarkably different for each person. The inverted spectrum thought experiment even challenges us to imagine that one person's blue might be another's red without any observable difference in behavior or language. In this way, even though we communicate as if our perceptions are uniform, they might be as varied as fingerprints. This discrepancy leads to a paradox. If every perception is inherently subjective, how can we ever be certain that our descriptions of reality, shared through language and social interaction, accurately reflect an objective world? We seem to operate on the assumption that there is a common external reality that all of us perceive similarly. Yet, the very act of perception is colored by individual context. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant have argued that while there might be a thing in itself, das Ding an sich, our knowledge of it is always mediated by our sensory and cognitive faculties. Thus, even if an objective reality exists, our access to it is always indirect, filtered through layers of subjective interpretation. The paradox is further complicated when we consider communication. We use language to describe our experiences and assume that others share our reference. But if our perceptions differ, then our words might not capture the full depth of each person's experience. This can lead to misunderstandings and disagreements, even when discussing ostensibly objective matters. It also raises questions about how social conventions and intersubjective agreements come into being. Perhaps they are less about an underlying uniform reality and more about negotiating a common ground despite our perceptual differences. Moreover, the subjectivity of perception paradox has implications for knowledge itself. If our sensory inputs and interpretations are subjective, then the certainty of what we claim to know about the world can be called into question. This has led some epistemologists to suggest that our knowledge is inherently provisional, and that true objectivity may be an ideal rather than an achievable state. In science, for instance, repeated experiments and shared observations are used to minimize individual biases. Yet the interpretation of data can still vary among researchers, highlighting the persistent influence of subjective factors. The paradox also has a profound impact on ethics and aesthetics. In art and literature, for instance, the idea that beauty or meaning is in the eye of the beholder reflects the notion that personal experiences shape our value judgments. What one person finds moving or beautiful, another might not. And this divergence is not necessarily a flaw, but an inherent characteristic of human perception. This recognition can be both liberating and challenging. It encourages tolerance of different viewpoints, while also questioning the possibility of absolute standards in areas like morality or artistic merit. In grappling with the subjectivity of perception paradox, we are invited to re-examine our assumptions about reality, truth, and communication. It suggests that while an objective world may exist, our understanding of it is always filtered through a prism of individual experience. This recognition does not necessarily undermine our ability to share and build common knowledge. Rather, it highlights the importance of dialogue, critical inquiry, and an awareness of our own biases. By acknowledging the inherent subjectivity of perception, we can strive for a more nuanced understanding of both our personal experiences and the collective reality we endeavor to describe. Ultimately, the subjectivity of perception paradox challenges us to balance our reliance on shared language and intersubjective validation with an appreciation of the individual, subjective nature of experience. It reminds us that while we may never fully escape the filters of our own minds, we can work together to approximate a common understanding, a process that is as much about the journey of communication as it is about arriving at definitive truths. Buridan's ass paradox is a classic thought experiment that challenges our assumptions about rational decision-making when faced with two equally attractive options. The paradox gets its name from the medieval philosopher Jean Buridan, who imagined a donkey, often called Buridan's ass, placed exactly midway between two identical piles of hay. Because the donkey has no rational basis to prefer one pile over the other, it is unable to decide which way to go. As a result, the donkey remains indecisive and, according to the paradox, eventually starves to death, even though both piles of hay are equally available. At first glance, the scenario seems absurd. In our everyday experience, we rarely encounter situations where the alternatives are perfectly equal. Even if two options appear identical on the surface, there are usually subtle differences, perhaps in context, timing, or personal bias, that tip the scales. However, Buridan's ass forces us to consider a world in which no such distinguishing factors exist. In such an idealized scenario, the rational decision-maker has no basis to choose one alternative over the other. This raises a number of intriguing questions. Does true rationality require a decision when the options are perfectly balanced? Or must a decision ultimately come down to an element of randomness or chance? One interpretation of the paradox is that it reveals a potential gap in classical models of rational choice. Traditional decision theory assumes that rational agents have a clear preference ordering, even if the differences between options are minute. But when two options are entirely indistinguishable in terms of expected benefit, the theory seems to hit a snag. There is no rational reason to choose one, and yet a choice must be made to produce an outcome. Some have argued that in such cases, a rational agent might resort to a random or arbitrary mechanism to break the tie, suggesting that even rational decision-making may involve an element of indeterminacy. Another angle to the paradox touches on the nature of free will. If a perfectly rational being is incapable of making a decision when confronted with two identical options, one might wonder whether free will is, in some sense, an illusion. After all, if no reason exists to favor one choice over the other, can the choice truly be considered free? This line of thought leads to deeper questions about the role of reason versus randomness in our decision processes. Is it possible that in the absence of external differences, a decision is simply a matter of luck? Or does the very act of having to choose imply that some hidden factors, perhaps unconscious biases or environmental cues, must inevitably influence the decision? Critics of the paradox often point out that, in practical life, such perfect symmetry rarely exists. Even in scenarios that seem to present two equally good options, minute differences or contextual factors almost always provide a tiebreaker. For example, if two job offers appear identical in salary, benefits, and location, an applicant might still choose one based on subtle differences in company culture or personal impressions during the interview. Thus, while Buridan's ass serves as a powerful theoretical tool for probing the limits of rationality, its real-world applicability is limited by the inherent messiness and complexity of human experience. Beyond individual decision-making, the paradox also has implications for collective responsibility and group behavior. Consider a committee faced with two equally appealing policy options. If every member perceives the choices as perfectly balanced and no clear decision is made, the group may suffer from a diffusion of responsibility where no one takes initiative. In such cases, the paralysis of indecision can lead to suboptimal outcomes for the collective, mirroring the tragic fate of Buridan's donkey. This has spurred interest in designing decision-making processes, such as voting systems or decision rules, that can force a resolution even in the absence of clear preferences. In summary, Buridan's ass paradox forces us to confront a fundamental challenge in rational choice theory: how to make a decision when the alternatives are exactly equal in value. It highlights the potential limitations of pure rationality, suggesting that even the most logical agents might need to incorporate elements of randomness or rely on subtle, often unconscious biases to break a tie. While the paradox may seem purely hypothetical, its implications ripple out into discussions on free will, the nature of decision-making, and the dynamics of group behavior. Ultimately, Buridan's ass reminds us that the process of choosing is sometimes more complex and more mysterious than our straightforward models would suggest. The unexpected hanging paradox is a thought-provoking puzzle that revolves around the interplay between prediction, surprise, and self-reference in the context of a seemingly straightforward announcement. Imagine that a judge informs a condemned prisoner that he will be hanged at noon on one of the weekdays in the coming week, but the day of the execution will be a surprise. He will not know the day until the executioner arrives. Faced with this information, the prisoner begins to reason. If he hasn't been hanged by Thursday, then Friday becomes the only possibility, which would make a Friday hanging predictable and thus not a surprise. Hence, he concludes that he cannot be hanged on Friday. With Friday eliminated, he applies the same reasoning recursively to Thursday, Wednesday, and so on, eventually deducing that a surprise hanging is impossible at all. Yet, contrary to his conclusion, the execution takes place on one of those days, catching him off guard. This paradox lies at the heart of a conflict between logical reasoning and the nature of surprise. The prisoner's argument is built on a backward induction that assumes perfect reasoning and complete predictability. However, the very act of using this reasoning to eliminate possible days undermines the guarantee of surprise promised by the judge. In other words, if the prisoner convinces himself that no hanging can occur, then any actual execution would be, by definition, unexpected. This self-referential loop, where the prisoner's conclusions alter the conditions of the surprise, creates the paradox. One perspective suggests that the flaw in the prisoner's reasoning is that it mistakenly assumes that the announcement's condition of surprise is something that can be logically deduced and thus nullified. Instead, the condition is inherently epistemic. It is about the prisoner's state of knowledge. Even if he logically deduces that a hanging on a particular day would be predictable, his deductions might not align with his actual state of surprise when the execution occurs. Essentially, the paradox underscores a tension between what we can deduce about our future knowledge and the actual unfolding of events that defy that deduction. Another angle to consider is the difference between logical possibility and practical expectation. The prisoner's logical elimination of each day might be sound in a strictly formal sense, yet in the real world, his reasoning does not account for the fallibility of human prediction and the dynamic nature of belief. When an event occurs contrary to his expectations, despite his seemingly impeccable deduction, the resulting surprise is genuine. This suggests that the paradox may highlight limits in our ability to use backward induction in scenarios where self-reference and epistemic conditions, like surprise, are involved. Philosophers have debated whether the paradox points to a genuine contradiction in the judge's statement or if it reveals a more subtle issue with our understanding of knowledge and prediction. Some argue that the judge's announcement contains an inherent contradiction. The conditions for a surprise execution cannot coexist with the logic of perfect foresight. Others maintain that the paradox simply exposes a gap between formal logical reasoning and the messy realities of human psychology, where self-referential expectations can never fully capture the complexity of surprise. Furthermore, the unexpected hanging paradox invites us to consider broader themes, such as the nature of prediction in systems where agents are aware of the predictions themselves. In many real-world scenarios, ranging from economic forecasts to strategic decisions in competitive environments, predictions can change behavior in ways that invalidate the original forecast. The paradox serves as a metaphor for these phenomena, illustrating how our expectations and actions are deeply interwoven. In summary, the unexpected hanging paradox is a rich and enduring puzzle that challenges our understanding of surprise, prediction, and self-reference. It demonstrates that even a seemingly simple announcement can lead to a complex interplay of logical deduction and human psychology. While the prisoner's backward induction appears to rule out any possibility of a surprise, the eventual execution reveals that our intuitive grasp of knowledge and expectation is more intricate than formal logic alone can capture. This paradox not only puzzles logicians and philosophers, but also offers valuable insights into the limits of prediction in a world where our knowledge about the future can, paradoxically, be self-undermining.